All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Uh, I guess, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a little tongue-tied, but this is an educational channel, and we try to check into great theories and concepts and discoveries that you're probably not familiar with because they've been suppressed. And this is another in our Bible Decode series. This is number 421. And that happens to be one of my favorite numbers. So this might be an auspicious occasion. Um, and we've looked at the New Testament of the Bible primarily through the lens of the Roman origins hypothesis. And that is the um, very suppressed and practically unknown, though populated by maybe even a dozen authors at this point, a dozen historian authors, not to mention dozens of literature writers throughout the ages, um, who have all pointed at the Roman Caesars as being the true authors of the New Testament. Yes, the New Testament was a psychological operation that is intended to put down the Jews, to tame, domesticate, and otherwise get the Jews to get with the program. Because the Romans occupied Judea in 63 BC, and for over a century, the Jews had been one constant headache after another for the Romans, one insurrection followed by an uprising, followed by a revolt, followed by a terrorist attack, and culminating in a full-blown war starting in 66 AD that lasted for 7 years and that required several of the Roman legions to put down. The Roman legions were under General Vespasian and his son, General Titus. These two eventually become the new emperors, the Flavian dynasty of emperors. And they had a vested interest in making sure that there was going to be no more of these Jewish uprisings. And they realized that the previous Jewish uprising had been started by uh, self proclaimed Jewish messiahs responding to uh, Jewish, Old Testament books that prophesied that a Jewish Messiah would come and help them to kick out the occupying power. Now, back in the days of the book of Ezra and so on, this occupying power was the Persians, before that, the Babylonians, but in this case, it was the Romans. And um, they wanted to kind of turn around that prophecy. And so instead, the Romans, created a Jewish Messiah who was instead a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldier's heavy backpack and turning the other cheek to oppression, while at the very same time putting down the Jewish traditions and rituals when Jesus, overturned the tables of the Jewish money changers at the outer reaches of the temple and screaming and yelling at the Jewish merchants selling small animals for the sacrifice at the same temple and complaining that the Jews are hypocrites for following their own traditions and rituals, and telling his Jewish followers that they needed to abandon their families in order to follow him. And then Paul, later on in the New Testament, is even more pro-Roman and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. These are all circumstantial signs that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. The direct evidence comes by a read of Josephus's book called War of the Jews. It's a history book of this war that was issued by Caesar's palace. Josephus was known as Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Adopted, albeit, but he lived in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and he had the full-throated endorsement of Emperor Titus or Emperor Vespasian, whichever was in charge when the book was issued. And perusing War of the Jews will, at the same time that you look over your New Testament, you will see so many parallels, parodies, parables, and other codes and coincidences that it will make the Q drops look like a you know, a sparse little you know, uh, uh, rain shower compared to a storm. And this is particularly true if you know what you're looking for. Start with the military campaign of Titus in Judea and compare that with the ministry of Jesus in the book of Luke. And you will see that for in about 40 separate occasions that every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. And they go to these places in the same order, and they encounter parallel events that are spaced out by 40 years, because the story of Jesus is backdated by 40 plus years, so that the prophecies of Jesus actually come true in the pages of War of the Jews. In particular, the prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem and how that is a marker of Jesus' second coming. Now, that destruction of Jerusalem was wrought by General Titus, and that makes General Titus the second coming of Jesus, and that makes General Titus the culmination of the Jewish lineage of kings, going all the way back to Adam, all the way through all of the patriarchs, you know, Noah and Abraham and Moses and David and Solomon and Jesus, and then Titus. The Romans were attempting to destroy the Jewish religion, and Christianity was the result. And so now 2,000, almost 2,000 years later, we have a tangled web. We have, um, you know, all kinds of religious fanatics out there that believe in their stated belief systems. Now, I haven't gotten into the New Testament, but I mean the Old Testament, but the Old Testament is not a religious book. It is a history book. The stories that they tell in the Old Testament are generally true as far as history is concerned, but there is no religion there. The word that they use to translate God is Elohim. And the Elohim is plural to start with. And it just doesn't mean God. It means, you know, more or less some big dude who is more powerful and more smart than you are, but has many other flaws that is makes him not God. Um, he has every personality disorder in the book, and he has a number of competing Elohim, Yahweh Elohim, that is the one that is the primary protagonist God in the in the Old Testament. And he has a bunch of competing Elohim that we generally think are satanic, like Moloch and Baal and Ashtoreth and Shamash. Um, these are just other dudes. There are no gods in the Old Testament, and there is no Satan in the Old Testament. Regardless, what we're looking at today is a book by Kersey Graves called 16 Crucified Saviors Before Christianity that looks at what the Romans actually did put in the New Testament, because they put in the kitchen sink everything that they could get their hands on, because the New Testament is a limited hangout. As a psyop, they have to put in stuff that is religious in content and inspiring in nature so that you actually believe it as a religion. Now, there's all kinds of poison pills in there, like the thing about Titus being the culmination of the Jewish lineage, and many other uh, pornographic jokes and ridicule and cannibalistic jokes. Um, but, you know, there's a lot of righteous material in there. That's why you all have a list of 200 or 300 Bible verses that you cling to for inspiration and for helping you in a bad situation, and, you know, to remind you of what you're here for, and so on and so forth. Those verses have been borrowed from much earlier sources, ancient Egyptian sources, and ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, religion, and mythology, especially Stoicism, and ancient pagan mystery schools, astrology, and numerology, shamanism, and magic, Persian, Zoroastrianism, and Mithraism, uh, ancient Chinese, Taoist, and um, even Japanese, Shinto, uh, Indian, Krishna, and Buddhism. Um, there might be a lot of Sumerian stuff in there that Mr. Graves was not aware of because those archaeological digs had not been done by 1876 at the time he was writing this book. There may be quite a few pygmy influences in the Roman uh, New Testament as well. We are in chapter 34 of this book that talks about some of the nature of miracles and prophecies in the New Testament. And I think we're about to start start a section that is, or we're continuing section that is, um, let's see, this is a more charitable and honorable explanation of the matter than that found in the assumption of other writers that every miracle was constructed for the occasion. Whereas he is saying that the miracles uh, were a part of the written history of other and more ancient gods. Okay, so he's saying that they got these miracles from ancient sources, like I was just saying, but he is holding out that it's possible that they just made them out of whole cloth. Um, okay, so then he goes, These critical writers tell us there was a religious persuasion deeply instamped upon the minds of all religious countries, that God often justified a departure from the truth. The conscientious or veracious faculty being in that age but feebly developed. And the Bible itself is full of evidence to establish the allegation. The prophets often disclose it, and the apostles were their strict initiators. I'm sorry, their strict imitators. Ezekiel represents God as saying, if I if a prophet is deceived, I, the Lord, deceived that prophet. And that's in Ezekiel 14:9. Jeremiah asked God, wilt thou be to me as a liar? In Jeremiah 15:8. Now, I happen to believe that Jeremiah was written by the Romans. The Romans wrote a number of the Old Testament books as well, as part of the Septuagint, which most scholars believe was written in the 3rd century BC, early 3rd century BC. But there is some evidence that it was actually written at the same time that the New Testament was written by the same people for the same reason, and that the Romans actually forced Jewish scholars to, uh, fabricate new books of the Old Testament, including the book of Job, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Daniel, the book of Ecclesiastes, um, the last 26 uh, chapters of the book of Isaiah, 27 chapters of the book of Isaiah, and there's a couple more. Jonah, and I think there's a couple more. Anyway, while the writer of Kings represents God as putting a lying spirit into the mouth of his own prophets in First Kings, also First Chronicles is written by the Romans. First Kings 22:23. And most certainly, if God himself might thus habitually depart from the truth, it was an ample warrant for his apostles, as well as the prophets, to adopt the same expedient. The case of Paul lying for the glory of God, which we have cited from Romans 3:1, proves they were morally capable of doing this. Mosheim tells us that among the early Christians, quote, it was almost universally adopted maxim that it was an act of virtue to deceive and lie, when by doing so they could promote the interest of the church. And this is exactly why Christianity is not a suitable platform to move forward into the golden age here for y'all truthers out there. You're about to win this war against the globalists, but to proceed forward on the basis of Christianity is a slippery slope right back into witch burnings, inquisitions, crusades, and the like, popes, uh, uh, dark ages that, you know, because, you guys talk about that you're being, you know, um, discriminated against and that you're being persecuted. These are signs that when you actually do get in power, then that reverses itself. Then you will become persecutors and you will have persecuted. You will get revenge on the people that are persecuting you now. And you may not think that's going to happen, but again, it's a slippery slope. And, you know, the thing is about Christianity is that there is a personality disorder that is at the core of it, which is that you are able to allow yourself to lie and deceive um, as an act of virtue if it is in favor of the church or the religion or your belief system, meaning that your belief system comes ahead of the truth. And as long as that is true, we know we're going right back to witch burnings. Maybe not immediately, but we're going back to witch burnings eventually if we go forward on your platform of Christianity. That's why this has got to stop right now. And I think a lot of you know this, and a lot of you can tell that I'm telling you the truth about this. Um, History, rhymes, history repeats it, and we're going into a different age, and Christianity is not suitable for this age, and really any religion is not suitable for this age. We all have within us the ability to determine what we, uh, you know, have seen, what our senses are, what our higher intelligences and spiritual faculties inform us uh, directly about God. And we do not need books and people telling us what these things are. And we don't need all these rituals and uh, rigmarole in order to, be pious. Uh, and we don't need these poison pill, uh, you know, morality statements like the Ten Commandments or whatever, or the Golden Rule, the Fool's Golden Rule, to tell us, what we need to do. We all have a conscience, unless we're a psychopath. Okay, and Godfrey Higgins informs us that great numbers of every age and every religion have been guilty of systematic frauds and falsehoods to support their religions, to an extent of which we can have no conception. They not only practiced it, but they reduced it to a system. They avowed it and they justified it by declaring it to be meritorious to lie in a good cause, according to Higgins. The reader who can hesitate to credit these statements only betrays his ignorance of the moral weakness of human nature and the imperfect growth in that era of the voracious faculty. Voracious with the VERA, as in the truth, which consequently had but a feeble voice in the councils of the mind. Even the most pious and devout professors of religion did not consider a rigid conformity to truth necessary or morally obligatory in their labors to promote the glory of God and the salvation of souls. And when direct falsehood was not resorted to, the writer still allowed himself to color, magnify, and invent largely, that is, to draw copiously upon the resources of his imagination in the way of supplying omissions and defects and filling out missing links in the chain of history. And hence it is that all ancient sacred history is so profusely inlaid with stories and statements manifestly fabricated for the occasion, without any historical support, and therefore wholly incredible. Let the Christian reader not, however, misapprehend us by supposing we wish to drive him to the extreme alternative of accepting this as the true explanation, or as indicating the real origin of the incredible stories and senseless, miraculous feats interwoven into the gospel life of Jesus. We only offer it as a plausible, but not as the probable explanation. The above citations from the scriptures and other history prove most clearly that sacred writers were morally capable of fabricating or manufacturing history to supply assumed omissions. And this explanation is twofold more reasonable than to accept the miracles as real occurrences. For such a belief would be at war with common sense and prostrate our reason beneath our feet. But there is no necessity of adopting lying hypotheses, while the borrowing theory is amply adequate to account for every gospel miracle. There is not a miraculous story or incredible legend incorporated in the New Testament as a part of the history of Jesus that was not afloat in some shape or form on the wings of tradition in nearly every religious country ages before his birth. The model for each and every miracle was already constructed, was already in the market, and already a part of the history or tradition of other and older gods. And all that was wanted to make it appear as a part of the history of the Christians deified Jesus was to fill in names and dates. Yes, history with 100 tongues proclaims it as the real explanation of the incredible and the impossible in the history of Jesus Christ. And the evidence is so voluminous and so overwhelming to disprove the common Christian dogma, which makes the Son of Joseph and Mary a miracle working God, that it really demolishes the last timber in the Christian fabric and leaves it a heap of ruins. And we are certain that if we could divest the Christian reader's mind for a few moments of an inherited and fostered prejudice, he would see that our explanation is much more rational, more probable, more beautiful than the popular belief, which degrades the illustrious Judean reformer to a level with the heathen thaumaturgist and gives him the same undignified reputation as a miracle worker. But we are sometimes told we are under as much moral obligation to believe in the miracles reported of Jesus as to believe in any other portion of his history, that we must accept his gospel history as a whole or reject it in toto. But this is manifestly a false assumption, and one easily exploded. No person who is acquainted with Grecian history doubts that Alexander the Great was born in Macedonia and founded a city in Egypt bearing his own name. Yet not one of those readers will credit for a moment what one of his biographers relates of him, that he stopped the sun in its course, or that he had no human father. We all accept Pythagoras as a real entity, while we reject the story of his walking on the air. Are we morally bound to accept Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome, as mere fabulous beings because their biographers relate the incredible story of their being suckled by a wolf? Many other illustrations might be given in proof of the falsity of the assumption that, because a portion of a man's biography is found to be incredible, the whole must be rejected as false, as unworthy of credence. This would be to annihilate history, for no biography of any person and no history of any nation can be accepted as plenarily pure, unmixed truth. There is always more or less chaff with the grain, and it is our privilege and our duty to separate them. And by so doing, we not only confer a favor on the cause of truth, but add to the luster and honor of the name of the deceased reformer. And especially is this true of the renowned Judean philanthropist and reformer. Much more lovely and beautiful would his evangelical history stand before the world if stripped of the wild, the weird, and the miraculous. Much more interesting is he when viewed and venerated as a man than when worshipped as a god, guilty of the frequent violation of his own laws by the display of the miracle working power. Indeed, however, even that part of the story is also fabricated, as the work of Josephus, set side by side with the work of the Gospels, will show you. And so it could be that Jesus really lived and he had a real life. And this is kind of the Gnostic point of view, that he was a man and that he was a very good man and that he did some incredible things, but all these miracles are just, uh, you know, need to be stripped away because of the myth-making power of natural in the course of time, over the course of time. But unfortunately, the story of Jesus is 100% completely a fabrication. And not to say that it might not be based upon real events. Um, I would say that there was no real Jesus, but there may have been many real Jesuses that you add them all together and they might have come up with this story. He's maybe a composite figure, maybe not, maybe he's entirely made up. But moving on, he says, and much more beautiful and much more rational is the doctrine which accepts every event that ever occurred as the legitimate and harmonious operation of the great machinery of nature, than as the smart trick, the lawless caprice or wild feat of an arbitrary, wonder-exciting God, performed not to make the people better, more moral, or more righteous, for miracles cannot do this, but merely to make them gape and stare and shout, "What a smart God we have got!" We must be the chosen people. We must be chosen by God because God picks favorites. Because God has a personality disorder and he is arbitrary and capricious, right? And then the belief in miracles involves an utter repudiation of all law, all order, and all system, and introduces in their stead chaos, anarchy, and universal confusion. It is simply the doctrine of chance, which all Orthodox Christendom professes to deprecate and execrate as the quintessence of atheism. But they make a mistake. Chance is more legitimately the fruit of miracle than of atheism, an assertion which we will here briefly prove. And I'm going to leave his proof of this for tomorrow. So we're going to stop right there today. And I guess tomorrow he's going to show us the proof of chance, of being more about miracle than atheism, whatever it was that he said there. Alrighty, thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute, and we will return tomorrow for another episode of the Bible Decode series. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.